Chapter 17, the autonomic nervous system. If you remember, the nervous system entire includes the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, along with the peripheral nervous system, the associated cranial and spinal nerves that innervate the entire body. So the brain and spinal cord, central nervous system, and peripheral nerves and nervous tissue outside of that makes up the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system, again, if you remember, has the afferent and efferent divisions. Afferent, A for info, stimuli, information being added into the central nervous system. And that is the component down here you see in, I guess that's yellow, right? Sensory input into the central nervous system. That's one function of the peripheral nervous system. And then the efferent division, E for exiting, motor commands exiting the central nervous system. That will then cause an effect by the effectors, whether that be skeletal muscle, smooth or cardiac muscle, or glandular cell activity, or breakdown or storage of adipose tissue. And that's the efferent division, which has both the somatic nervous system, and then there's the autonomic nervous system, which we'll focus on in this chapter. So afferent division, again, sensory input into the central nervous system. Efferent division, motor output from the central nervous system to the appropriate effectors. Stuff that we've looked at already. So let's compare somatic and autonomic nervous system. Motor output from the central nervous system, that's the peripheral nervous system, efferent division. So the somatic nervous system is those motor commands that are voluntary conscious and that go to the skeletal muscle effectors. So if you're going to, swat that mosquito I talk about all the time, or pet your cat, that's a conscious motor command that is initiated in the brain. Signals go down to the spinal cord, exit at the appropriate spot at the spinal nerves, innervating the effector skeletal muscles. Where's my cursor? Sorry. And then you affect whatever output you want, like, petting your cat, swatting that mosquito, or at least trying to. That's the somatic nervous system, voluntary commands. With the autonomic nervous system, which is what we'll focus on for the rest of the chapter here, these are motor commands that are unconscious, involuntary, that will again affect the activity of smooth muscle, whether it's your digestive tract or within the blood vessels, cardiac muscle, right, increasing, decreasing the rate of heart contractions and strength, glandular activity in the body, and then the storage or breakdown of adipose tissue. So the ANS, autonomic nervous system, has these two divisions, parasympathetic and sympathetic division. And on the simplest comparison, or the simplest contrast and comparison, is that these two divisions work in opposition of each other. As we'll see, the sympathetic division, we often call it the fight or flight division. This is when your body responds to what may be perceived as emergency type situations, things like increasing blood flow to the musculature, dilation of the pupils. When you get stressed by some particular situation, think if you've ever took a speech class and your name gets called, your sympathetic division gets activated. And that's right here. Now the parasympathetic division essentially works in opposition to the sympathetic division. Rest and digest division is often called. It issues commands to conserve energy, slow down your cardiac heart rate, things like that. Diverting blood supply from the skeletal muscles, often to the digestive system, to digest food, that sort of thing. So these tend to work in opposition of each other. Parasympathetic division versus the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So let's look at the functional and structural arrangements of the A and S. So afferent neurons originate in the visceral organs. So that means afferent, right? So this is sensory input into the central nervous system. Again, A for adding stimuli into the central nervous system. So with the autonomic nervous system, afferent neurons originate in the organs, whether they be the stomach or glandular tissue, cardiac muscle, the heart, right? Sensory neurons innervate these organs and or glands, and then they send visceral sensory input via the afferent pathway, sensory input into the central nervous system. The dorsal root ganglion, dorsal root, etc., going into the spinal cord and then up into the brain. Okay, nothing new there. We've talked about this before. The efferent neurons, right? E for muscle output motor commands exiting the central nervous system, innervate the visceral organs. Again, smooth muscle, glands, etc. Again, nothing new. We've talked about this before. That is the motor commands exiting the spinal cord at the anterior or ventral roots. Now, one difference, major difference that we see now that we didn't see before with the somatic nervous system. So let's look at that somatic nervous system. All right, autonomic. A peripheral nervous system for motor commands to your effector skeletal muscles under conscious control. The cell bodies of the efferent neurons, the motor neurons, are within the central nervous system. Remember those motor neurons, their cell bodies are in the anterior or ventral gray horns of the spinal cord. Excuse me, cursor's going to sleep. And then the long, relatively long fibers or axons go all the way to innervate, in this case, skeletal muscle at the neuromuscular junction. And there, once the action potential nerve impulses hits the axon terminals, the neurotransmitter acetylcholine gets released, stimulates the motor end plate and sarcolemma of the skeletal muscle fibers, the cells, and initiates all that sequence of events internally, release of calcium by the sarcoplasmic reticulum, etc. Sliding filament theory, fibers contract, the sarcomeres contract, right? The myofibers contract, the skeletal cells, fibers contract, the entire muscle contracts. And we've talked about that in a previous chapter. However, with the autonomic nervous system, there are two efferent neurons, not only one. Somatic nervous system, there's one. Excuse me, those motor neurons. With the autonomic nervous system, efferent neurons, there are two, as you see here. Sympathetic division, color-coded in green, parasympathetic in purple. Notice that there's one neuron, efferent neuron, that initiates or starts in the central nervous system, and then it synapses with the cell body of a secondary neuron that will then synapse at the actual visceral organ. So there's two efferent neurons. This shows you the same thing. And in this situation here, the adrenal medulla gland that resides right above your kidneys acts as a secondary neuron that also releases neurotransmitters in the form of these two chemical epinephrine chemicals and norepinephrine. And then in the parasympathetic division, we have the first efferent neuron. Just like in the others, their cell bodies are in the central nervous system. Then it synapses with the second efferent neuron that then releases its neurotransmitter, its chemicals at the visceral organs. Okay? So two efferent neurons. The first one is referred to as the preganglionic neuron. Its nuclei is in the central nervous system, as I mentioned here. All right, central nervous system, brain or spinal cord. It's referred to, the first one, the first efferent neuron in the autonomic nervous system is referred to as the preganglionic neuron because its cell body and its axon or fiber is before the ganglion, where the synapse with the second efferent neuron occurs. And again, we're considering the adrenal medulla as the second efferent neuron structure. So ganglion, adrenal medulla, we'll consider it in terms of a ganglion in the sense that the cell bodies here, the cells that are producing these chemicals, are synapsing with the preganglionic efferent neuron. Okay, so this neuron is physically and structurally and functionally occurring before the ganglion, before the adrenal medulla, before the ganglion. So those are the preganglionic nuclei. Their cell bodies are in the central nervous system. The second cells, neurons, are the postganglionic neurons, and their nuclei are in peripheral ganglia. Ganglion is singular. So there's the second neuron, efferent neuron. It's called the postganglionic nuclei or postganglionic neuron because it is outside of the central nervous system. Its cell body is in a ganglion. Ganglia is plural. And if you remember, ganglia are aggregations of cell bodies, right? Neuron cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. All right? There's a cluster of cells here, so that can be considered functionally as a ganglion, this adrenal medulla, and then there's another ganglion there. Okay? Peripheral ganglia, because they are outside of the central nervous system. So those are the originations of what we're calling the postganglionic neuron. So again, autonomic nervous system, two efferent neurons. Contrasting that to the simpler somatic nervous system where we have just one efferent neuron, that motor neuron, innervating skeletal muscle. So let's go back to, I think this is chapter 14, when we were introducing the nervous system to review a few concepts. So if you remember, the dorsal rami innervate skeletal muscles of the back. There's your, or the spinal cord. There's that nice bump, that road landmark, dorsal root ganglion, cursor, dorsal root ganglion. So dorsal rootlets, right? Sensory neurons innervating and synapsing with interneurons, interneurons in the dorsal gray horn, interneurons synapsing with motor neurons in anterior horns. So then there is your anterior root, rootlets, right, motor commands. So the two roots merge, there's your spinal nerve, there and there, okay? And then if you remember, the spinal nerve branches to a posterior branch called the posterior ramus or dorsal ramus, and then the anterior ramus here. Okay? So then those dorsal rami, plural, innervate deep skeletal muscles of the back. Right? Posterior, anterior. Okay? The ventral rami would innervate, right, the ventral body wall, limbs, etc. Oh, here we go. Innervate ventrolateral body surface, body wall, limbs. And then the autonomic nervous system sympathetic fibers form these rami communicans, as you see here. And then this is a obvious structure that we will spend time on, the sympathetic trunk chain ganglia, showing just two of them here. Okay? So those are structures of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic division.